Yes. Do I want to do this? Do I want to do solo duels first? Yeah, I do have to do one more solo duel, actually. And I think I did want to clear out the solo mode, start getting some of these out of the way. Or was I? I just did the... Oh, I thought I did... Okay. Dark Dead Vengeance. I think this is sort of like Resident Evil based one. Let's start with the first scenario. Dark Dead Vengeance. It's very Resident Evil-ish, I believe. Within the concrete jungle of high-rise buildings, the people hustled and bustled among the sleepless city lights. However, that was a long time ago. A darkness that shrouded the sky above turned the world into one that would never see morning come again. This is, like Seraph of the End. And with the darkness came monsters that threatened the peace of the city. The Vendreads. This is, the zombies. The Vendread started as corpses that crawled out of their graves, except their bodies had transformed into something grotesque. Without a single shred of their memories from their past life or any will of their own, they would wander the streets at night and attack any living human or animal in their path, guided only by their instincts. Something I realized, I don't think there's a chat overlay. I think I need to look into that, because that's what the other program had. There was a... I would be able to see chat on my screen instead of having to look over all the time. No firearm, tank, or any sort of modern weaponry could defeat these creatures. What's worse, anyone and anything that was unfortunate enough to become a victim of the Vendread would become one themselves. The Vendread threat was like a match thrown into a forest, spreading fear like an uncontrollable blaze. As the undead continued to rapidly multiply, those remaining of flesh and blood scrambled fruitlessly for a solution. The Vendread hordes soon made their way to the hastily built wall that served as the sole line of defense for the living. Give me a second here. I'm trying to figure out how. What is a quick way for me to... Okay, I can pop this out. But it immediately goes away. Okay, among them was a young man who had also lost his life to the undead. Huh. Maybe I can do this. Okay. Bop. Okay, this will probably make it easier for me to see if a message pops up. Alright, hold on. Of course, in order for me to test it, I immediately have to close the very window. Okay. We'll just try it. He was no different from the other Vendreads, wandering the same shrouded city with the same mindlessness. But, as luck would have it, one day, as the young man continued to drift about mindlessly, he came across a young woman who had been carried off by the Vendreads. Yeah, I think this was his wife. His mind had already long faded, or it should have, but as his eye caught the locket that hung from the woman's neck, something stirred within him. Memories of his past life began to flood into his head in a great crashing wave. He knew the woman with the pendant before him. She had once been the love of his life. His mind twisted and turned with a desperate sadness as he realized that his love was no longer of this world. That sadness soon boiled over into a seething rage and hatred for the Vendreads that robbed her of her life. As his mind dragged itself out from the bogs of its undead depths, a flame of hatred ignited his heart. Let the rage... The violent burst of emotion tore his body apart with unbearable pain as it began to transform and rebuild itself into something much stronger. The Vendread. When the transformation ended, the man steadied his uneven breath and stood up. He took the locket and hung it around his neck so he could keep the memory of his beloved close by. Then he spoke into the silent night. Super Spawn. I swear I will vanquish every last one of these walking corpses if it's the last thing I'll do. And thus the new agent of vengeance was born. He was the Vendread who would hunt the other Vendreads. Vendread Slayer. This was the beginning of the lone Revenger's fierce battle. Even in that day, the living struggled bravely from within the city wall to keep alive. Dun, dun, dun. This is some good music. The Vendread horde that pursued the living pushed against the barrier like crashing waves, and showed no sign of ever stopping. Their numbers seemed to only be going up too. They continued to groan and wail deep into the night, day after day. The terror was too much. The citizens were finding it harder and harder to keep sane under these horrific circumstances. But then, a single shadow loomed over the horde. The shadow darted forth and cut down a Vendread with a single swoop, quick as lightning. But he didn't stop there. Any Vendread that dare stand in his way would be stabbed, hit, kicked, and knocked down. They would have their limbs and rotting flesh torn, twisted, and ripped from their bodies. And once the shadow had finished hunting down every last walking corpse that plagued the city wall, he disappeared back into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared, not even sparing a single moment to look back at the crowd he had just saved. But the Vendread Slayer was not interested in being a hero. All he wanted was revenge. He would not stop at anything to destroy any Vendread that entered his line of sight. That's the incorrect site, I believe. It should be SIGHT. What is this a Kuro Games localization? Huh? But regardless of his intentions, the fact was that he swooped onto the scene like a bolt from the blue and defeated all the Vendreads. To the survivors, he was their single ray of hope. Word of the mysterious undead hunter began to spread quickly through the city. As the nights continued, he too continued his battles. However, the Vendreads weren't going to stand for being hunted down so mercilessly. With the carnage, the undead began to change. Up until now, the humans and animals that were turned into Vendreads had stayed about the same physical size they had been when they passed. That was one of the main reasons the survivors had been able to keep the horde back with just their average human strength. However, now that the Vendreads were being pursued by a relentless executor in the form of a Vendread Slayer, they began to feel threatened. Some of them even began to merge with each other to create a bigger Vendread. Few words could describe how grotesque it looked, and people began to name it after a certain multi-headed beast of legend. They called it the Vendread Chimera. The creature would threaten the safety of the people beyond the wall for many more nights. It possessed the powers and strengths of numerous Vendreads, and even the Slayer was beginning to have trouble fighting it. Every time they battled, the Slayer would only just manage to fight it off. He was never successful in completely silencing it. However, the more they fought, the more weakness were uncovered. The Slayer found that within the Chimera there lay a core that governed all of its actions. The Slayer charged at the core and threw all his strength into it, destroying it. And finally, the Chimera crumbled into a pile of rotting flesh and bones. At first, it seemed that the Slayer's do-or-die attack had ended things once and for all, with the of animosity that was the kind of amalgamation, I want to say is what that word should have been. But the tragedy would only further unfold from here. The clash of the undead would only escalate further and further into something beyond human comprehension. All the survivors could do was pray that one day the Vendread would be vanquished and dawn would break once more over their city. After a long and bitter struggle, Vendread Slayer would finally destroy the Vendread Chimera threat. No one could predict that this defeat would only bring more dreadful threats. One day, the Slayer felt a menacing presence like never before. Overflowing with an unabating grudge, he immediately headed towards it, determined to find the source. He saw that the wall had been broken through, even though it had held up well against the Chimera threat. The wall and the scavenged armored vehicles that were taking the brunt of the attacks were destroyed, and countless people were found slain. The Vendread horde had a different leader now. It was much larger than the Chimera had been. He was clad in heavy armor, enveloping it was a thick and ominous aura of resentment. Is this Super Armageddon? Demise, the King of Armageddon, Super. It was Vendread Battlelord, and it had been born from the grudges of all the Vendreads that the Slayer had defeated. Their collective hunger for vengeance against the Slayer had combined into a frightening force, and wherever the Battlelord went, it would leave a trail of death and destruction behind. It was one lone fighter's wish to eradicate the Vendread against the Horde's desire to crush their Executor. Their rage came to a head, and thus another clash to the death began. The Battle Lord's might was far more tremendous than the Slayer would ever have imagined. Not only could it absorb the surrounding Vendread, but also those who had lost their lives at the scene. The Battle Lord had a steady supply of fodder, and it only grew more powerful as time went on. No matter how strong the Slayer's desire for revenge was, his blade stood no chance against his foe. No chance against his foe. What is this? What is this? He pushed and tried everything he could to gain the upper hand, but in the end, he was overwhelmed by the Battle Lord's immense strength. Dark dead. Vendread Slayer lay limp on the ground, wounded and battered, like he was a rag doll that had been flung aside. Vendread Battle Lord picked up the small hunter in its enormous hand. I can't see. Okay, this is like the dude's leg. Then, just as it had done the other Vendreads and the fallen victims, it reached its other hand toward the Slayer's chest to absorb his power. The Slayer's consciousness was sinking into nothingness fast, but then the faint glint of his locket caught his eye. That tiny gleam was enough to remind him that his mission was not yet over. With his conviction renewed, the flame in his heart lit up once more. No wound on his body could stop him now. The Slayer mustered all the strength he had left, and right before the Battle Lord could absorb his powers, he plunged his hand into the Vendread's chest and ripped out its core. Holding the core, the Slayer began to feel a new surge of energy. His body was absorbing the hateful power that the Battle Lord had possessed. The tides were turning, with the Battle Lord's powers flowing into the Slayer now. Its body started to crumble. However, just as the Slayer began to think the fight was finally over, the core, struggling for survival, brushed against the Slayer's pendant with a stray hand. The Battle Lord's remain, along with the Vendreads that surrounded him, began to transform. They all began to take on the form of the woman that the Slayer cherished in his previous life. With that single touch of the locket, the core had sensed the remaining dregs of the Slayer's love and sought to destroy his morale with it. The Slayer froze. Was this a dream? No, this was no dream. He shook his head, trying to remind himself that the love of his life was already gone. This was a nightmare that was trying to ensnare him. He balled his fists in anger. How dare these scum disgrace the memory of his beloved? Hada! Super Vendread Slayer. As his burning rage surged and finally exploded, he found himself transforming into a new form. With stronger powers, he had become the Vendread Executor. Fueled only by his scorching hatred, Vendread Executor swooped through the horde and cut down the false figures of his beloved, one after another. He had been fighting his foe for days that could no longer be counted all alone, and after absorbing Vendread Battle Lord, his grudge only grew bigger with his Vendread powers. It was barely being kept in balance with his human heart. His mind and body had long pushed past their limits. It was already a miracle that he was able to exist with both life and death in one vessel. It didn't matter anymore. If what remained of his humanity faded or if his body fell apart, nothing could stop him now. All he had on his mind was to fight and fight and fight. He threw everything he had into this single desire. Then, at long last, the Vendread horde moved no more. The battle had finally come to a close. The rays of the sun broke through the dark veil of the sky, illuminating the Slayer. Just how long had this war waged on for? The city survivors squinted, unaccustomed to the bright light. But oh, what a joyous sight it was. No one ever thought they would see the end of those eternal nights. But here the sun was in all its glory. The Slayer could feel his body fading with the light. He bent over to pick up the locket that had been taken from around his neck. All the Vendreads had been defeated and the darkness that engulfed the city was gone, but at the end of the day, he too was a Vendread, and now it was his time to go. The Vendread Executor. Rebirth of the Vendread. That's going to be the next archetype. Now that the undead threat had passed with the endless nights, the survivors were able to return to their peaceful lives. However, the grief of losing so many lives left an unmendable hole in their hearts. A lot of the survivors also developed a fear of the night and would be plagued by nightmares of the horrors they had faced. Unbeknownst to them, a single shadow watched over them from atop the glowing skyscrapers. Okay, so he didn't die. Just like he had saved the city, the survivors had saved him. Although the Slayer had set out for revenge, he had still saved countless lives and they all celebrated him as their hero. They were able to hold onto hope because of this lone fighter and as the Slayer was slipping into the darkness on that fateful day, the survivors' kind hearts had pulled him back. Thus, he was able to remain in the mortal world without disappearing like the other Vendreads. And the world ever fell to darkness again. If the monsters threatened the lives of the people again, he would surely swing his blade for them once more, but this time without the resentment he once harbored in his heart. If that time ever came, he would fight not for vengeance, but for peace, and to give the people courage and hope that they needed it, when they needed it.